Hello there, booktube. I hope wherever you are, you're having a good day. Yeah, today's been all right. It's been a bit wet today, but I'm looking out the window and I can see some blue sky, so that's quite nice. But today I'm not here to talk about the weather. I'm here to talk about The Awakening by Kate Chopin. Finished it a few days ago. Been trying to mull over, try and just get some clear, definitive thoughts about the book, and hopefully I can share a little bit about them as I go through the book and maybe a few of the plot points, and I'll try not to spoil too much. I read it on my Kindle, so maybe you'll have to take everything I say with a tiny grain of salt, because I have a small doubt about whether I was actually reading an authoritative version of this text, but I definitely got a good impression of the book from what I read. So what's it about? I thought I'd just read you the Wikipedia article, or the first couple of paragraphs, and then we'll see whether that sort of impression from the Wikipedia article kind of measures up to my experience of reading it. So, The Awakening is a novel by Kate Chopin, first published in 1899, set in New Orleans and on the Louisiana Gulf Coast at the end of the 19th century. The plot centres on Edna Pontellier and her struggles between her increasingly unorthodox views on femininity, I can never quite say that word, and motherhood, with the prevailing social attitudes of the turn-of-the-century American South. It is one of the earliest American novels that focuses on women's issues without condescension. It is also widely seen as a landmark work of early feminism, generating mixed reaction from contemporary readers and critics. The novel's blend of realistic narrative, incisive social commentary and psychological complexity makes The Awakening a precursor of American modernist literature. It prefigures the works of American novelists such as William Faulkner and Ernest Hemingway, and echoes the works of contemporaries such as Edith Wharton and Henry James. It can also be considered among the first Southern works in a tradition that would culminate with the modern works of Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, Eudora Welty, Catherine Ann Porter and Tennessee Williams. Overall I kind of agree with that. At its basis, it's a story about an unhappy marriage, about Edna Pontellier realising that her place in society as a woman in a marriage, as a woman with children, that isn't what she wants for her life, and it's about her trying to fill that void, about her maybe just working through this anxiety. And for a novel that is about someone realising that they don't much like their domestic life, what I found really interesting about the way the book begins is that we're not given a snapshot of the domestic life. We're not given maybe a sweeping introduction of the family, as you might have in earlier Victorian novels. Instead, it starts almost in the heat of the action as things are about to change with the family on holiday. It's an unfamiliar place, anything can happen and all that stuff. And Edna's been making new friends, has been going out to the beach every day and things like that, and isn't terribly involved in her family's life. There's a nanny looking after the kids, and her husband is often going off to the club and all that sort of stuff, doesn't get home till late. Edna's a fair few female friends who she enjoys talking to, and she's also made a friend with this young man called Robert, who's been teaching her to swim. And it doesn't really take you that long to realise that there's something going on between them, that they quite like each other. And the first kind of controversial point obviously is that Edna's already married, and for a work written at this time, I think even just the suggestion of that must have been quite controversial. And for all her happy, fun excursions, this taste of liberation kind of opens up a kind of a dread in her. I think it describes, it's described as a vague dread. Something you can't quite put a finger on. It kind of reminds me of existentialist writing. It almost is you know, a kind of domestic existentialist book. And for as much fun she's having, she can't seem to get this dread, this anxiety away from her. Eventually, Robert suddenly leaves. This throws all kinds of doubts into her mind, and the holiday ends. And for me, that's where the book, you know, it took a bit of a turn for me. And I suppose it's a purposeful turn, because suddenly she has to go back to normal life. The holiday's over, the fun's over, she has doubts about Robert, and so there's a slight, I don't know, the filter changes, I suppose. It's not as bright after that point for Edna, even if she is, from that point on, trying to be more independent. So when she's on holiday, there's this kind of flowery language in the way that, in people's conversations and things, and you can maybe think that everyone's being a bit tongue-in-cheek, you know, with the way they're speaking, with being so dramatic about how splendid everything is and all that stuff. And then once you get to back to the city, back to day-to-day life, there's still some of that language going on, but it doesn't feel quite as tongue-in-cheek. Instead, it's actually that is just what the people mean. It's kind of like being in an Oscar Wilde, you know, play or book, only you're not really supposed to be laughing at them, and it kind of makes you pity some of the characters with the way they're speaking. And so the magic is kind of gone once they get back to the city. But Edna decides that she's going to be independent. She's going to throw herself into her art. She wants to paint more. She's showing people some sketches. They quite, you know, they think she's good, and she's going to make that her focus. And I think for her, at least at this point, she's thinking that her main problem is her marriage. Really, we already know that her and her husband don't get on. He works away at Wall Street. He's not terribly involved in her life. She's not terribly involved in his life. They're kind of just getting on with their social roles, really, and there's not much intimacy there. And so in a way, with him being away, he thinks that it's just a bit of a whim for her, and she, you know, with him being away, she can do what she wants. So she's throwing herself into her art, and as much as she does this, as much as she makes calls to the friends that she made on holiday, she even has an affair. That anxiety doesn't go away. She's still thinking of Robert, whether anything is ever going to happen between them, and stuff like that, and realising that maybe independence from her husband isn't necessarily what is causing this dread. And this is where it kind of almost falls apart for me, because this lack of a relationship with her husband is actually explored with quite a lot of depth. You're prepared for it, I suppose. You have quite a few scenes where you're shown this, and then later on, I'm trying not to necessarily spoil it, but you realise that it's not necessarily the relationship with her husband that's the problem, but it's her being a mother, it's her having children that is weighing her down. And for me, I just didn't believe this. There wasn't anything much in the book that made me feel that there was any pressure there or any tension there, because she was such an absent mother throughout the whole book. We're told that, you know, she's an absent mother, that every now and then she has a sudden wave of affection for her children, but the rest of the time she's quite cold to them, and, you know, will just kind of let the nanny get on with it, and maybe she'll buy the kids sweets every now and then or something. So yeah, I just didn't believe that was the problem. Yeah, for me that was really the only issue I took up with the book, really. But I don't want to have that set in stone, because obviously I might want to read a different edition, just in case that the text I had wasn't the authoritative version. So they're my general thoughts on the book, on what happens. Yeah, I think that's really as much as I want to say. I think it's a really interesting period to be looking at. I find this turn of the century period to be quite fascinating. It's a world where that we can see things on the brink of change. Maybe people could, well, definitely people could feel that, but there's still a lot of there's still a lot of I suppose hand-me-down attitudes from the Victorian era there, and plenty of other later writers will pick up on that and write about that too. So I suppose this is where comparisons to other writers comes in. And at least for me, I could definitely find that comparison between her and Henry James there, particularly when going back to the city. There's a kind of stiltedness, a politeness that in books like The Europeans I could definitely draw some connections to, although where the story goes is quite different. But for me, the more interesting comparison is not where this book, the authors that might be inspired by this book, the movements that might be inspired or come after this book, but instead where this book comes from and some other books that deal with similar themes but in quite different ways. And obviously when you're thinking of stories about relationships between men and women, about societal norms and things, at least two of the writers that come straight to my head, probably would come to most people's heads, would be Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte, or any of the Bronte sisters really, but I suppose mainly Charlotte. I suppose there's some of the doubts that are thrown at you, maybe similar doubts that might be thrown up in Jane Eyre. Some of the issues brought up maybe are brought up here, but we still have the resolution and the marriage at the end, as we always do with a Jane Austen book as well. And what's fascinating about this book, and what makes this book really still stand out to me, is that it's a book about after marriage. We've had our resolution, our marriage, what now? So many books are about the before, and I just find it fascinating that this book is about the after. I'm sure there are plenty more books that deal with this in different ways, but for that I found it a very interesting book, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why this book is still such an interesting book for so many people. There are probably other things that I could go into, but I think that's everything I really have to say about it for now. I hope you found that interesting. If you've read The Awakening, I'd love to hear what you thought of it, whether you agree or disagree with what I said. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you're thinking of reading The Awakening, I'd love to hear why, maybe why it's up on your radar. And yeah, I'm going to try and at least commit to reviewing the other books that I put on my The Mookse and the Gripes bucket list tag, and I'm hoping to do more reviews in the future anyway. It's something that I've let slip a bit on the channel. But there we have it. I'll be back soon with something else, I'm sure, and I'll see you all soon. Bye.